Welcome to Stormwatch 2023. I'm Mary Blakeney, coming to you from the Governor's Hurricane Conference at the Palm Beach County Convention Center. For more information on preparedness, go to readypbc.com. Now let's take a look at some of the interviews we conducted during the conference. I'm now joined by Jamie Rome, Deputy Director of the National Hurricane Center. Welcome, Jamie.
Thank you for having me.
We're so glad to have you here, coming off of what a season last year was. So I really want to dive right into the 2022 hurricane season and talk to you about what was that experience like at the National Hurricane Center, and let's just dive right into it.
Yeah, it was a little bit different for me, because our existing director, Ken Graham, was promoted to the director of the National Weather Service, which is our parent organization. As the deputy director, I had to take the mantle of leading the nation's hurricane program with little notice. And so I was the acting director through the entire 2022 hurricane season, which was an interesting experience to say the least. It looked like it was going to be a slow season there for a little while, and then we had Ian and Nicole basically back to back hitting the Florida Peninsula.
So let's talk a little bit about the 2022 storms and walk us through the season and kind of some of the lessons learned from each of those storms.
There was so many lessons learned. First of all, so many people develop these mental models in their head about how a hurricane season is going to go and how a hurricane threat is going to go. And I really need people to stop doing that, because last year, not only did we have a late start to the hurricane season, we had a late ending. Remember, Nicole struck Florida very, very late in the year, and a lot of people had already tuned out and lowered their guard. It's counterintuitive, but often experience in hurricanes works against you. Like, usually new residents to Florida are inquisitive, they're open to public information from local officials such as yourself. It's the people who've been here for decades that don't listen. They're the ones I worry about, because they think they can make a forecast and they think they know better.
So let's talk about that, because there are so many tools and websites and phone apps that people go on. So what would your advice be to those people about all of those tools out there?
You wouldn't walk across your yard and ask your neighbor to perform open heart surgery. It's absurd. It's silly. Why? So why do people think that you need no professional skills to predict something as complicated as a hurricane? So there's just way too many people on social media and online that are amateurs, and they're spreading misinformation. So you've really got to scrub your content and go to trusted sources. And there's really, local officials, local emergency managers, in the National Weather Service and National Hurricane Centers. You really got to get down to government issued information and warnings.
I really appreciate that. So talk about that product, because I think maybe the general public doesn't know how much agencies like the National Hurricane Center and the National Weather Service work with the local governments.
Yeah, and there's this misnomer out there that we just look at these spaghetti plots and just pick one, and that's the forecast. First of all, when you look at those spaghetti models, you're only seeing a fraction of the available information that I have and our forecasters have. A fraction, maybe 10%. Secondly, we have advanced algorithms to critique and evaluate all that information and present it to our forecasters in a condensed way. And third, we have our forecasters that have decades of experience to pore over that information and make a forecast. We're then working with local authorities such as yourself to present that information and to help you make the best decisions for your community in terms of preparedness and mitigation, whether an evacuation is needed, when an evacuation might be needed, to what degree, how far inland. And so we're in lockstep with each other. So if they're hearing it from you, they might as well be hearing it from the Hurricane Center.
No, and that's great to share. And I want to segue that into evacuations, because I'm always telling people, and we're trying to educate people, unless you're in a mobile home or some type of unsafe structure that you don't feel necessarily safe in, we only evacuate people because of a storm surge threat. But I think we have seen, and we often hear, people don't understand what storm surge is. So how would you want to explain it to our listeners about what storm surge is?
So we see two scenarios associated with evacuation in hurricanes. The first is a community hasn't been hit in a long time and nobody evacuates, and the community gets hit really, really hard. All right. So then the next hurricane that comes to that community, everyone evacuates and they go to Georgia. And that's just as bad. What we want is a granular evacuation. And here in Palm Beach County, your evacuation zones don't go, tremendously inland. So we're looking for, when you call an evacuation, you're asking people to evacuate blocks and miles, not leave the state. You might not even need to leave the county unless you've got family members that you can get to easily. And so this notion that we're just going to evacuate up I-95 into South Carolina and North Carolina, that's not effective evacuation. The evacuations need to be more strategic, because if you live in a well-built home, modern building code, and you're outside of the storm surge threat, you could be putting your family at greater risk by evacuating.
And that's a great point, because I think Hurricane Ian is a perfect example of that. People don't realize a storm can make 2 landfalls, right? So that is definitely a threat for us. So let's talk a little bit about Cat 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 storms. What would the Hurricane Center tell about preparedness for our residents, whether it's a Cat 1 or a Cat 5?
People are going to be surprised to hear this, but I would ignore it. I would ignore the Saffir-Simpson scale, because it tells you only the peak wind in one spot of a hurricane. It doesn't tell you what the peak wind is going to be in your community, right? So if you see a storm approaching and it's a Cat 4, that may or may not mean Cat 4 winds in your area, right? Especially if you're far removed from the center. What we want people to focus on are the hazards, meaning storm surge, wind, tornadoes, and heavy rain. Heavy rain is emerging as a big threat in these storms, and that's the one that's hardest to convey to people, because it's like, oh, it rains all the time here in the rainy season. How could that be life-threatening? But until you've seen a rain from a hurricane, you haven't seen it rain. I mean, it can rain 20, 30, 40 inches in some of these hurricanes, and if it comes in a very short amount of time, you get this flash flooding, especially in urban areas.
And I think the thing that we need to stress is those impacts can happen well outside of where people expect the eye to make landfall. So,
and they can happen in tropical storms too. The typical Floridian down here, I'm a Floridian, so I can pick on Floridians. The typical Floridian down here is like, tropical storm, I'm not going to do anything. And those are the people that you're having to go rescue and take care of after an event. The people who flippantly dismiss these quote unquote lower end storms because they're looking at it just from the Saffir-Simpson scale perspective versus looking at it from the hazard perspective.
Jamie, I could sit here and talk to you all day. I wish we could, but thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Oh, this was a treat. Thank you.
We'll be back with more Stormwatch.
Hello everyone, Kevin Guthrie with the Florida Division of Emergency Management. As we get ready for this year's hurricane season, we want everyone to know your home and know your zone. So please go to our website, floridadisaster.org/know, to find out your flood zone area. Also go to your local property appraiser's office to find out when your home was built. Thank you, and let's make sure we're all prepared for this year's hurricane season.
Welcome back to Stormwatch. I'm Mary Blakeney, now joined by Robbie Berg, Senior Hurricane Specialist with the National Hurricane Center. Welcome, Robbie.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
We're so glad to have you back again this year. So let's talk a little bit about what new things or maybe some exciting products or things you're working on at the National Hurricane Center.
Yeah, sure. So this year we're excited because one of the products that we issue every 6 hours, 4 times a day, is our tropical weather outlook, which essentially tells you what is the chance that a weather system in the Atlantic might become a tropical depression or tropical storm. Historically, we've been issuing that for the next 5 days, but now starting this year, we're going to do that for the next 7 days. So it's going to give everybody an idea of what should we be watching in the Atlantic over the next week.
What do we expect to gain from 2 more days?
So it's about situational awareness, because we know it takes people time to get ready for storms. Not that we're saying get out, rush, and get your supplies when that system enters the outlook, but it's hey, there's something out there, I should be watching that. Maybe every morning, maybe even twice a day, you go back to the outlook and just see how it's changed. What are its chances? Have they increased or decreased?
So what would be the reason to increase from the 5 to 7? Do you have data that shows something about those extra 2 days?
We do. We've actually been testing this internally for the past couple of years at the Hurricane Center. And what we found is that our 7-day forecasts are just as reliable as the 5-day forecasts. So in other words, if we say there's a 40% chance of a system developing, it actually happens 40% of the time.
That's great. And you know, we've heard a lot from the National Hurricane Center about, you know, studies and the development of your products.
Right.
And I don't think people realize there's a lot of scientific information that goes into those forecasts. So share with us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so our forecasts have a little bit of both physical science and social science. And I think that's really important. So a lot of new physical sciences have been developed, new techniques, and that has made our forecasting more accurate through the years and more consistent. But it's not just making a perfect or good forecast. We have to communicate that forecast as best as possible. So for that, we usually rely on the help of social scientists to tell us, how should our products look? How should particular graphics look to make sure that people understand the forecast that they're getting?
So let's talk about this year, what we're looking at in this upcoming season. You hear all kinds of things about water temperature and wind currents. So share with our viewers what we're looking at for the 2023 season.
Right, so I'm not going to hide it. I mean, everybody's probably heard that an El Nino is forming. El Nino tends to suppress hurricane activity in the Atlantic, but it doesn't tell the whole story. And it's actually a distraction a bit, because we still see hurricanes in El Nino years. Hurricanes still hit land in El Nino years. And one thing that's not going for us is that the water temperatures in the Atlantic are very warm. Hurricanes like warm water. So even if we do go into El Nino this summer, it's not going to mean we're safe. There's still going to be hurricanes. We still need to prepare this year just as we would any other year.
So when you all are focusing on that formation of that weather system, tell us a little bit, give us a little inside look into what you do as a hurricane specialist when you see something forming.
Yeah, so it's our job to monitor the Atlantic Ocean every day, all day, essentially during hurricane season. We're looking at satellite imagery. We often send the aircraft hurricane hunters out to look at systems that might be in their formative stages. And really what we're looking at is, does the system have what's called a closed circulation? In other words, we want to see if the wind is circulating around in a circle around a center. Once that happens, we designate the system as either a tropical depression or tropical storm, depending on how strong the winds are at that time.
So can you tell, as the storm is forming, we've talked a lot this week and in recent months about all of the hazards within a hurricane.
Right.
Is there any way to identify how strong those hazards will be when it's forming, or how can we educate our viewers a little more about those hazards?
Yeah, so the hazards are tricky because oftentimes we only know what the hazard is going to be when we know where the storm is going to affect. So for example, you look at storm surge, it's very contingent on exactly where the storm is going to make landfall because of things like the shape of the coastline or what the ocean bottom is like at that location. So you can take the same storm and have it make landfall, say in Southwest Florida, or have it make landfall in Maine, way up in the Northeast, and it's going to produce two totally different types of storm surge. So that's why we want people to understand their local risk. In a sense, almost ignore the Saffir-Simpson scale because it's not going to tell you the full story of what your risk is when a hurricane threatens.
And we recently heard from Jamie Rome, the Deputy Director of the National Hurricane Center,
Right.
saying the same thing about ignoring the Saffir-Simpson scale. So let's dive into why people should do that. What
Sure.
is the reason we should educate our people to just ignore that?
So maybe I should be more specific. It's not to ignore the scale totally. Obviously, 4s and 5s are extremely dangerous. We know they're going to cause extreme wind, likely extreme storm surge. But the problem is that people are looking at Cat 1s, 2s, even tropical storms that don't meet the category as nothing to worry about. But yet we still see storm surge. We still see very heavy rainfall and flooding from storms that are not as strong as those 4s and 5s. So it's not necessarily that we're saying ignore the scale entirely. What we're really saying is you need to take the 1s, the 2s, just as seriously as you would the 4s and the 5s.
Oh, and that's great information about that, because there is never, and I look at your predecessor in the past, that from the Hurricane Center, Ken Graham said, it's not just a,
right.
It's not just a
Exactly.
tropical storm. It's not just a Cat 1. So let's talk a little bit about those other hazards though. You know, we've learned a lot about what those hazards do to people and the loss of life. So what is the biggest concern when it comes to these big, powerful storms?
In one word, it's water. We've seen when we look at how people have been dying in tropical systems, it's because of water. In fact, 9 out of every 10 deaths from tropical systems in the United States have been from a water hazard. And that includes storm surge, rainfall, rip currents. Oftentimes, you might have a bright sunny day at the beach and there's a hurricane well offshore, but it's producing rip currents at the beach, which can be dangerous and deadly. And we're seeing people lose their lives in that as well. So the winds are important in a storm. Don't get us wrong. We need to shelter from that. But it's the water that people just don't understand is the most severe hazard from these storms.
Robbie, this has been great information, and we're here to protect our residents, and we appreciate the time you've spent with us today. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, again, thanks for having me.
Now let's hear what was learned during the Governor's Hurricane Conference.
Don't let her looks deceive you. Meet Miss Piggy, the hurricane plane. This little plane can withstand some of the most powerful storms on the planet. Palm Beach County leaders had the opportunity to take a look inside at all of her updated technology.
Welcome aboard, sir. This is the nose radar, which will be depicted up here. So we use both of these for our situational awareness to advise the pilots on what we recommend or we would think would be the safest route.
Hurricanes are one of the most dangerous natural disasters on Earth. They can cause enormous damage to property and take countless lives.
Well, Miss Piggy here flies through storms at about 8 to 10,000 feet. We'll have a crew of about 15 to 18 on board during a flight of about 8 to 10 hours, with 4 to 6 of that in the storm environment.
Miss Piggy's job is to help scientists better understand hurricanes so that they can predict them more accurately and save more lives.
How we collect the data that goes to the forecasters and informs their decisions, so that when they get a decision, they have to make a decision about whether to evacuate or to make sure people take shelter. They know they're getting it right from the storm based on our aircraft flying through it and gathering it for them.
And her crew are no slouches either. They are some of the best pilots and scientists in the world, dedicated to keeping people safe from the dangers of hurricanes.
So it's like an old wooden roller coaster with the jumps and the jitters, and maybe you'll get a couple of drops here and there, but mainly it's just, jittery as you're rattling along. And then you've got the just constant whoosh of the rain as it's hitting the windshields.
In a storm environment, I would be working the power levers, and we have an indicator that will that gives us airspeed.
So the next time you hear about a hurricane forming, remember Miss Piggy and her crew working tirelessly.
So we'll have one crew flying, another crew can prep and then take over that aircraft, or they can use our other aircraft.
Miss Piggy, the hurricane plane. Cute, but tough as nails.
What's going on, bad weather, Heather?
I got these documents. I think these are the right supplies. Am I even in an evacuation zone? What am I supposed to do with all of this?
Don't worry, bad weather, Heather. There's an app for that.
Really?
That's right. The Palm Beach County Disaster Awareness and Recovery Tool, or PBC DART, has lots of great information and tips to use before and after a disaster. You can even report damage to your property.
How do I get it?
You can download it from Google Play or the App Store for free. There are also links on readypbc.com.
Who doesn't love a free app? I'm downloading it right now, so I'm ready, Eddie.
Be ready, be informed. For more tips like this, visit readypbc.com.
Welcome back to Stormwatch. I'm Mary Blakeney, now joined by Dan Brown, Senior Hurricane Specialist with the National Hurricane Center. Welcome, Dan.
Hi, thanks, Mary, for having me.
We're so excited to have you here, and we're talking hurricane season. So as a senior hurricane specialist, tell us a little bit about what you do in your role there.
Sure, I'm one of the 10 forecasters at the National Hurricane Center that actually puts together the track, intensity, and size forecast for all the storms that we have. You know, we're using satellites and aircraft to help us do that, and we'll basically have 2 forecasters on every shift starting on May 15th all the way through the end of the hurricane season at the end of November.
So let's talk about what goes into those forecasts. How are they developed?
Yeah, so really when we sit down to make a forecast, we first look at satellites, look to see how organized the storm is. We have tools that we can estimate intensity from satellite, but we also then, if the storm is threatening land, we'll want to fly the aircraft in. So we have NOAA and Air Force hurricane hunters that will go in, and we get that data back at the Hurricane Center, and it can help us determine how strong the storm is, how big the storm is, and exactly where it's located.
So let's talk about some of the forecasts that were done during the 2022 season. We had a couple very impressive storms. So can you walk us through that from your position about the development of the products for those storms?
Yeah, I was working several overnight shifts for Ian, and the overnight shift puts out that 5 a.m. It's a really important forecast because it's kind of what's going to set the tone for everyone as they wake up that day. That night, Ian was in the southeast Gulf of Mexico. From satellite, we didn't realize it had really rapidly strengthened overnight. We got a plane that was a little late getting in, but once they got in the storm, we realized it had strengthened quite a bit. And really only had just a few minutes. It was about 40 minutes before the forecast was to be issued, but we were able to analyze that data, determine that it had become a Category 4 storm, and it really honestly helped the messaging in the forecast for that landfall that occurred later that day. It helped me to forecast it to be a Category 4 storm, and again, to maintain that intensity, again, just showing how vital getting that aircraft data can be.
And you know, you bring up a really good point that I don't think we've ever talked about. You know, we see hurricane forecasts come out on a regular basis, but I don't think people realize it's new data every forecast, correct?
Oh, absolutely. We're always getting new data. And in fact, sometimes it means we massage what we did just 6 or 12 hours earlier. We can get new data suggesting it might have been a little stronger. And by changing the analysis, even in real time, it can help the models that we use to make those predictions, to make better predictions, especially when we look at the intensity forecasting.
At what point do you decide, wow, this is going to be a very strong storm? Do you know that well in advance, or do you have to see the buildup of the storm?
It depends on the storm. We've gotten better at forecasting rapid strengthening, and by that we mean about a 35-mile-per-hour increase in winds over a 24-hour period. And both with Ida the year before and Ian last year, we were able to accurately predict some of these rapid changes in strength. Again, it's coming down to better modeling that we have, better observations, and just understanding the structure of the storm and knowing when that structure has reached a point that it can now take advantage of those favorable conditions around it. And we did that with Ian. We were able to forecast its rapid strengthening that it was going to be a major hurricane by the time it reached western Cuba, and then again be a major hurricane over the southeastern Gulf of Mexico. We have come a long way in forecasting rapid strengthening, but it's been just in the last few years. We look at the results just in the last 3 hurricane seasons. Our era for intensity forecasting has been cut in half whenever we've seen or observed or forecast rapid strengthening.
So you come out with these forecasts how many times a day?
So we actually produce 4 new forecasts per day, every 6 hours, coming out at 5 a.m., 11 a.m., 5 p.m., and then 11 p.m. And it takes us about 3 hours to make that forecast. About the first 45 minutes is the analysis part, what I've kind of talked about. And then we have about an hour to actually make the track forecast, looking at those models. We look at the spaghetti models, but we use our expertise and experience to really diagnose those models, to understand which one is going in what direction. And then we make an intensity forecast, and finally we make a size forecast. And then all that information goes into where the watches and warnings are going to be placed, and also where the hazards are going to occur. Where's the storm surge, where's the wind, and where's the rainfall going to be a problem?
And that's a lot of information to do 4 times a day. So are there ever times where in between that you have to put out additional information?
We do. We're always getting new data in, especially when we're flying the aircraft. So things can change, and sometimes it can change pretty quickly. During Ian, I made that forecast at 5 a.m., but it wasn't an hour or so later that we got indications that Ian was even stronger. And so it required us to have to put out a special forecast. We call those special advisories. and it was to increase the intensity, the initial intensity, and also the forecast intensity of that storm. It doesn't happen very often, but when it does, we want to get that information out as quickly as we can.
So we talk about hurricane season. We always say, people need to realize that it's 6 months long. But there is a little level of complacency, right? Usually on the front end and sometimes on the back end of the hurricane season. So last year, heading into November, let's talk about Nicole.
Again, it's rare. That was only the third November hurricane to strike Florida, but it happened. That's why the hurricane season does continue through November, because we can see storms. Generally, they're in the Caribbean further south, but we have seen them in the past. We'll probably see them again. But again, it's a good reminder that we have to stay vigilant all the way through the end of hurricane season, but also at the beginning of the season. When the storms form early in the season, they typically form either the Northwest Caribbean Sea or the Gulf or just off our southeast coast here. So they typically affect areas like Florida, Northwest Caribbean Sea. So it just shows we always have to be ready as we get to June 1st.
So when we talk about the 2022 season, Ian and Nicole, it seemed like a lot of significant storm surge with both of those events. Are we seeing a difference or a shift in maybe the direction of the storms or the intensity of them that could be causing that?
Well, with Ian, it was such a large storm. We had Charlie back in 2004, same intensity, same landfall location, but Ian was just much bigger and caused that devastating surge. Nicole was really the same. Nicole was a very large late season storm, also produced a lot of storm surge, a lot of wave action along the east coast of Florida. One thing that we are concerned about is with climate change, there is the rise in sea level. And that rise in sea level, the base level of the ocean, could cause higher surge and more inland penetration. So it's something that we have to be aware of. But last year, I would attribute the surge that we saw really to the size of both of those hurricanes that struck Florida.
So looking ahead to this year, anything new coming out of your shop?
We're going to put out an outlook that's now going out 7 days, so that'll be something new. We have a couple new models that we'll be looking at this year as well. So there's always things changing at the Hurricane Center. We're always, again, trying to make a better forecast, use all the data that we can. That 7-day outlook, I think, will give folks a little bit more heads up when something could form. Again, it's not a 7-day hurricane forecast, but it's just going to look at where systems could form, where they might impact over that 7-day period. Once they form, you'll get your 5-day forecast, and all that information goes to our emergency managers to help make those evacuation decisions.
Dan, great information you shared with us today. Thank you for everything you and your other forecasters do for us.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Stormwatch from the Governor's Hurricane Conference at the Palm Beach County Convention Center. I'm Mary Blakeney. Stay safe.